The morning my husband introduced me to the woman he had been seeing for 11 months, he did it in my own kitchen, standing next to my refrigerator, wearing the shirt I had ironed for him 2 days before. He said her name like I was supposed to smile. He said she was going to be staying with us for a while, like that was a normal sentence a husband says to his wife on a Tuesday morning. I remember the coffee in my hand going cold because I stopped moving entirely. I had been the one who painted that kitchen. I had been the one who chose those cabinets, scrubbed that floor on hands and knees after the pipe burst, hung that curtain rod 3 times until it was level. And now I was standing in the middle of everything I had built, being told that another woman was going to sleep under its roof. What my husband did not know, what he could not have known because he had stopped paying attention to me a long time ago, was that I had already made a decision of my own. And the person I had invited into our situation was going to change every single thing he thought he had figured out. Before this story goes any further, I want to ask you something honestly. If the person who was supposed to protect your home brought someone else into it and looked you in the eye like you had no right to feel anything, what would you do? Would you leave quietly? Would you fight? Would you stay calm and let the truth do the work for you? Think about that as you listen to what Nadia did, because what she chose was not what anyone expected, and it worked in a way that no argument, no confrontation, and no public scene ever could have. Nadia was 34 years old and she had spent the last 7 years building a life that looked, from the outside, like exactly what she had always wanted. She had a home in a quiet neighborhood with a yard that she kept herself. She had a job she was good at, working as an office manager for a mid-sized architecture firm where she had slowly become the person everyone depended on to keep things running. She had a husband named Daniel who was charming and well-dressed and very good at convincing people, including Nadia for a long time, that he was more hardworking and more devoted than he actually was. She had a small group of close friends, a mother she called every Sunday, and a sister named Priya who was getting married in 4 months and had asked Nadia to be her maid of honor. From the outside, Nadia's life looked full. From the inside, she had known for almost 2 years that something was wrong. It had started small, the way these things always do. Daniel worked in real estate development and he traveled a lot, which had always been part of their arrangement. Nadia had never been the kind of wife who needed constant check-ins. She trusted him. She had built her entire understanding of their marriage on that trust. But 2 years before the morning in the kitchen, she had started noticing small things that individually meant nothing and together meant everything. A name that appeared too often in passing conversation. A phone that was never left on the counter anymore. Evenings where he came home distracted in a way that had nothing to do with work stress. A weekend trip that he said was for a developer conference, and which she later found out, through a completely ordinary coincidence involving a mutual acquaintance, had no conference attached to it at all. Nadia had not confronted him immediately. That was one of the things about her that people sometimes misunderstood as passiveness, but was actually something closer to careful patience. She did not like to accuse someone of something she could not prove. She did not like emotional explosions that led nowhere. She had watched too many people in her life burn everything down in one angry afternoon and then spend years rebuilding from the ash. So Nadia watched. She listened. She kept her face neutral and her mind very busy. She started keeping a small notebook. Not in a dramatic way, not in a spy thriller way, but in the quiet, organized way she kept track of everything in her life. Dates, details, things Daniel said that did not line up with what happened later. She wrote down the names she kept hearing. She wrote down the dates of the trips. She wrote down the times he came home and the moods he carried with him. She was not building a legal case. She was building clarity for herself, because she needed to know the difference between her imagination and the truth before she did anything at all. By the time the morning in the kitchen arrived, Nadia had been clear for about 4 months. She knew about the woman. She knew her name was Simone. She knew Simone was 28, worked in marketing, and had been in Daniel's life for almost a year. She knew this not through dramatic investigation, but through the slow, accumulating evidence of a man who had gotten careless because he believed his wife was too distracted by her own goodness to look close. Daniel had always underestimated Nadia. That was, in the end, his most expensive mistake. What Nadia had done during those 4 months of clarity was something Daniel would never have predicted, because he had never fully understood who she was. She had not cried in front of him. She had not asked questions she already knew the answers to. She had not made scenes or threatened or begged. Instead, she had made appointments. She had sat across from a financial advisor and gone through every account, every asset, every shared investment with careful and thorough attention. She had sat across from a family lawyer named Patricia who had a calm voice and a reputation for being very good at protecting women in exactly this kind of situation. She had begun the slow, legal, completely above-board process of understanding what she was entitled to and what steps she needed to take. She had done all of this quietly, professionally, and without a single dramatic speech. And then she had made one more decision. She had called her Aunt Rosa. Aunt Rosa was her mother's older sister, a woman who was 61 years old, sharp as a blade, and had survived enough in her life to be completely immune to being impressed by people who thought they were clever. Aunt Rosa had been a property manager for 30 years. She knew contracts, she knew tenants, she knew rights, and she knew exactly how to make herself very comfortable in a situation where someone had tried to make her feel unwelcome. Nadia had called Aunt Rosa 3 weeks before the kitchen morning and explained the situation with the same calm clarity she had been building for 4 months. And Aunt Rosa had listened, and then said simply, "Tell me when you need me and I will be there." So on the morning Daniel introduced Simone in Nadia's kitchen, what he did not know was that Aunt Rosa was already scheduled to arrive that Friday. What he did not know was that Nadia had spoken to Patricia the lawyer twice in the previous week. What he did not know was that Nadia had already begun the financial documentation process, had already requested copies of every shared account statement, had already reviewed the deed on the house which, as it happened, was in both their names but had been purchased largely with a down payment that came from Nadia's inheritance from her grandmother. A fact that Patricia had told her was very relevant and very important. What Daniel knew was that he had brought Simone home and told Nadia she was staying, and Nadia had looked at him with those calm, dark eyes and said, almost pleasantly, "All right. I have some arrangements of my own to make as well." Daniel had not known what to do with that sentence. He had expected tears or fury or a slammed door. He had prepared himself for a big scene that he could then use to justify his behavior the way people who are doing wrong things always try to find a way to make their reaction to being called out the bigger problem. But Nadia gave him nothing to work with. She put her coffee in the sink, picked up her bag, and went to work. And the whole drive there she breathed steadily and she thought about Friday. Simone moved into the guest room that Wednesday. Nadia knew because she came home to find a suitcase in the hallway and a toiletry bag on the guest bathroom counter. She also came home to find Daniel standing in the living room with an expression that was trying very hard to look casual and was not quite succeeding. He said something about how this was just temporary and how he hoped Nadia could be mature about it. Nadia looked at the suitcase, looked at Daniel, and said she was going to start dinner. She made enough for two, served herself a plate, and ate at the kitchen table with a book open beside her. She did not make a plate for Simone. She did not make a plate for Daniel. She finished her dinner, washed her dish, and went upstairs to read. That night in her room, she let herself feel everything she had been holding carefully together for 4 months. She cried into her pillow quietly, the way people cry when they are very tired and very sure and also very done. She was not crying because she was broken. She was crying because she was finally letting go of the last thread of hope that this had all been a mistake, that Daniel was still the person she had married, that the life she thought she had built was real. It was not. And now that she knew that completely, she could move through what came next without any confusion about what she was protecting. She was not protecting a marriage. She was protecting herself. Friday came. Aunt Rosa arrived at 11 in the morning, which was 2 hours before Nadia came home from work and approximately 45 minutes after Daniel had left to show a property across town. Nadia had given Aunt Rosa a key 2 days before, telling Daniel she had gotten a spare cut for a friend, which was accurate enough. Aunt Rosa let herself in, looked around the house At Nadia had built and loved and kept, put her large bag in the second guest room, which was the room farthest from Simone's, and made herself tea. Nadia arrived home at 1. She came through the front door to find Aunt Rosa sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea and a magazine, looking like she had lived there for decades. They hugged for a long moment, and Nadia did not let herself cry because she had already done that, and this part required steadiness. They sat together and talked in low voices, going over everything, the timeline, the documents, the plan. Aunt Rosa had brought paperwork of her own. As a property manager with 30 years of experience, she had a very complete understanding of what it meant to be a legal occupant of a shared property, what rights a resident had, and what a co-owner of a property could and could not do without the consent of the other co-owner. She had prepared notes. She had printed relevant statutes. She had, in her calm and organized way, armed herself and Nadia with exactly the kind of quiet, legal, absolutely undeniable information that made people like Daniel very uncomfortable. Simone came downstairs at around 2 in the afternoon. She walked into the kitchen expecting it to be empty or to find Nadia alone, and instead she found two women sitting at the kitchen table with paperwork between them and a teapot in the center. Aunt Rosa looked up at Simone with the particular expression of someone who is not surprised, not threatened, and not interested in being managed. Simone stopped in the doorway. She looked at Nadia. She looked at Aunt Rosa. She looked at the papers on the table. And then she said, with the careful tone of someone who was suddenly not sure how this house worked, "Who is this?" Nadia said calmly, "This is my Aunt Rosa. She is staying with us for a while." There was a pause that lasted just long enough to mean something. Simone said, "Daniel didn't mention anyone else was coming." Aunt Rosa said, without looking up from her papers, "Daniel doesn't own this house alone." Simone opened her mouth, closed it, and then turned around and went back upstairs. Nadia poured herself more tea. Neither she nor Aunt Rosa said anything for a moment, and then Aunt Rosa made a small sound that was not quite a laugh but was clearly satisfied, and they went back to their paperwork. Daniel came home at 6. He came through the front door and went to the kitchen, which was where he usually started when he got home. and he found Aunt Rosa at the stove making rice and lentils, filling the kitchen with a smell that immediately and completely belonged to Nadia's family and to no version of the life Daniel had been trying to build in this space. Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment. He said, "Who are you?" Aunt Rosa turned around and looked at him with complete calm. She said, "I am Rosa, Nadia's aunt. You can call me Mrs. Rosa. I will be staying here for the foreseeable future." She turned back to the stove. Daniel found Nadia in the living room. He sat across from her, and his voice had that particular controlled quietness that meant he was trying not to shout. He said, "You cannot just bring someone into this house without asking me." Nadia looked at him for a moment. She said, "You did." He started to say something about how that was different, and Nadia let him talk. She did not argue, she did not raise her voice. She waited for him to finish, and then she said, "Rosa is a co-owner on the lease agreement I had added to the property documentation this week. You would need to speak to my lawyer if you want to discuss her occupancy." She picked up her book. "Dinner will be ready at 7." Daniel went upstairs. From behind the closed door of the guest room where Simone was staying, Nadia could hear raised voices. She could not make out the words, which was fine. She did not need to. She opened her book and read 3 pages and actually absorbed all of them, which told her that despite everything, she was all right. The next 2 weeks were unlike anything Nadia had ever experienced, but she moved through them with a steadiness that surprised even her. The house had become a very strange place. There was Simone, who had arrived expecting to settle into a situation and instead found herself in a house where another woman had deep roots, a lawyer on call, and an aunt who moved through the kitchen like she had been doing it for 30 years, because she had been doing it in one kitchen or another for exactly that long. There was Daniel, who was increasingly frustrated because none of the reactions he had prepared for were happening. He had expected Nadia to collapse or explode or leave. Instead, she was making lentils and reviewing documents and sleeping 8 hours a night and going to work in the morning looking exactly like herself. There was Aunt Rosa, who was genuinely one of the calmest and most quietly intimidating people Nadia had ever known. Aunt Rosa did not confer. Aunt Simone, she did not insult her. She did not try to make her feel unwelcome through any overt act. She simply lived in the house in a way that made very clear that this was Nadia's house, that Nadia's history was in every wall and corner and cabinet, and that whatever Daniel had imagined was the new arrangement was not quite matching reality. Aunt Rosa cooked food that filled the house with warmth. She played radio programs in the morning. She spoke to Nadia in their family's easy, old, comfortable shorthand that no outsider could fully enter. She was not performing. She was simply being herself, and being herself in that house was, without any effort at manipulation, a reminder of whose house it actually was. Simone came to Nadia 3 days into the second week. She knocked on the door of the room Nadia was using, and Nadia told her to come in. Simone stood in the doorway, and she looked, for the first time since she had arrived, like she was not quite sure of herself. She said she wanted to talk woman to woman. Nadia put her pen down and waited. Simone said she had not known Daniel was still living with his wife when she met him, which was partly true and partly not, and Nadia could tell the difference but did not say so. Simone said she was uncomfortable in the house, that the situation was not what she had expected, that Daniel had told her Nadia was already planning to leave, that she had been under the impression Nadia had basically agreed to this arrangement. Nadia listened to all of it without interrupting. When Simone finished, Nadia said, "Daniel tells people what makes his choices easier. He does that with everyone. You are not the first." She paused. "I do not blame you for what he told you. But I want you to understand clearly that I did not agree to any arrangement, and I am not planning to leave my home." She picked up her pen again. "That is all I have to say." Simone left the room. That night, Nadia heard her on the phone with Daniel, speaking in urgent, low tones for a very long time. The following morning, Simone came downstairs with a packed bag. She was in the hallway putting on her shoes when Daniel came down the stairs. They spoke quietly near the front door. Nadia was in the kitchen with Aunt Rosa eating breakfast, and she could hear the shape of the conversation without the words. She could hear Daniel trying to convince someone to stay and not succeeding. The front door opened and closed. She heard Daniel's feet on the stairs and then the sound of the shower and then silence. Nadia poured herself more coffee. Aunt Rosa spread jam on her bread. Neither of them said anything about what had just happened because neither of them needed to. But this was not the end. Nadia knew it would not be. Because Daniel was still in the house, and Daniel was a man who did not take losses quietly, and the financial review that Patricia had now been working on for 6 weeks was beginning to produce results that Daniel was not yet aware of and would very much not like. The marriage had lasted 7 years. During that time, Nadia had been the more consistent earner for the first 4 of those years while Daniel was building his development business. She had paid the majority of household expenses. She had contributed more than 60% of the down payment on the house from her grandmother's inheritance, a fact that was documented clearly and completely. She had co-signed on a business loan that Daniel had taken to fund his first development project, a loan that had since been paid off but whose history created a financial record that Patricia found very useful in constructing a complete picture of what Nadia had contributed to this marriage. Patricia had been very thorough. and her thoroughness had produced a document that was many pages long and pointed very clearly in one direction. Daniel knew the financial review was happening because Nadia's lawyer had communicated with his lawyer. But Daniel believed, in the way that people believe things when they are used to things going their way, that the final outcome would still somehow favor him. He had a story ready. He had told Nadia in one of the very few direct conversations they had during those weeks that the house was as much his as hers, that they had both contributed, that a court would see it as a shared asset and they would split it down the middle, and that Nadia should just accept a clean break and move on with half. He said this in the tone of someone doing someone else a favor. Nadia listened to the whole speech, then she said, "You should call your lawyer." 2 days later, Daniel's lawyer called Patricia. Patricia relayed the details to Nadia in their next meeting with the calm efficiency of someone delivering expected news. The financial picture was not the 50-50 split Daniel had counted on. The down payment documentation, the earnings history, the loan co-signature, and several other financial contributions that Patricia had traced and documented added up to a position that was significantly stronger than Daniel had anticipated. Patricia recommended they proceed with filing. Nadia said yes. What happened next was that Daniel received formal legal paperwork and had a very loud phone call with his lawyer that Nadia could hear from the next room, because she was still in the house, because it was her house, and she had nowhere to be that evening except exactly where she was. After the phone call, Daniel came to find her. He was not shouting, but his face was tight in the way of a man who is holding a shout inside his chest. He said the filing was not necessary, that they could handle this privately, that going through lawyers was going to make everything worse. He said the word family 3 times in 2 minutes, which was interesting given recent events. He said he still cared about her, which may have even been true in whatever way people care about someone they have badly wronged but still want something from. He said she did not have to make this a war. Nadia looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I am not making it a war, I am just being accurate." She folded her hands in her lap. "You should focus on your legal representation, I am focusing on mine." She stood up. "Aunt Rosa made lamb stew, if you are hungry, there is enough." She went to the kitchen. Daniel stood in the living room alone for a while, and then she heard his keys, and then she heard the front door. He came back late, he was quieter after that. During all of this, Nadia had also been dealing with something else entirely, something that lived alongside the legal process and was in some ways more emotionally complex. Her sister Priya's wedding was in 2 months, and their mother, whose name was Helen, had been calling every few days with wedding questions and with something underneath the wedding questions that Nadia recognized as worry. Helen knew something was wrong. Nadia had not told her family the full situation yet, partly because she needed to be in a more settled legal position before she opened that conversation, and partly because her mother had always had a soft spot for Daniel and Nadia was not ready for the version of that conversation that might include anyone trying to convince her to reconsider. She told her mother the broad shape of it on a Sunday call 3 weeks into the process. She said she and Daniel were separating. She said it calmly and clearly, and she did not leave room for it to be debated. Her mother was quiet for a long moment, and then she said the things Nadia had expected. Was she sure? Had she tried counseling? Did she understand what divorce meant? Had she thought about what people would say? Nadia let her say all of it, and then she said, "Mom, I need you to listen to what I am actually telling you, not to what you are afraid I am saying." She paused. "He brought another woman into our home and told me she was staying. I have a lawyer, I have a plan, I am not asking for permission. I am telling you because I love you and you deserve to know." Another pause. "I am okay, I need you to believe me." Her mother was quiet again for a longer moment, and then she said, "I am coming this weekend." Helen arrived Saturday morning with food, a sharp expression that Nadia recognized as the particular fury of a mother who has put her protectiveness on hold for too long, and a suitcase for 2 weeks. She walked into the house and looked around at the way people look at places they love that have been treated badly. She hugged Nadia for a long time. Then she went to the kitchen where Aunt Rosa was already at work, and the two sisters looked at each other with the wordless communication of women who have been watching out for their family for a very long time. And Rosa said, "I made coffee," and Helen sat down and picked up the papers on the table and started reading. And from that moment forward, Nadia had her whole team in place. Daniel came home that Saturday evening to find 3 women in his kitchen, Nadia reading, Aunt Rosa cooking, and Helen sitting at the table looking at him with the eyes of a mother who has moved past disappointment into something much quieter and much more final. He said hello with the voice of someone who understands they have made a serious miscalculation. Helen said hello back with the voice of someone who does not need to say more than hello to make her meaning completely clear. Daniel went upstairs. He stayed upstairs a long time. The following week was the week things began to shift in the ways that mattered practically and permanently. Patricia had filed the petition, the legal process was officially in motion. The financial documentation was complete, the picture it painted was, as Patricia put it in her measured way, favorable to Nadia. The house situation was the largest single issue. The down payment history was clear. Nadia's contribution to the household over the years was documented. Daniel's lawyer was working with what he had, but what he had was significantly less than he had expected to have. Daniel tried a few things during that week. He tried being contrite, coming to Nadia with the specific humble tone of a man who thinks contrition is a strategy. He said he had made mistakes, that he had lost his way, that he still believed in what they had built together. Nadia listened and felt nothing shift in her, which told her everything she needed to know about where she was in this process. She said she appreciated him saying that, and she told him to direct any further communication to Patricia. He tried talking to Helen, which did not go well for him in the way that conversations with Nadia's mother now never went well for him. He tried a version of the same speech he had given Nadia with Helen, and Helen let him finish, and then she said in the quiet voice that was scarier than shouting, "You brought a woman into my daughter's home. Into the home she built while she was still sleeping under that roof. And you stood in her kitchen and told her it was temporary, like she was the guest." She shook her head once. "I think you should talk to your lawyer." He tried, in the second half of that week, to reach out to some mutual friends, people he and Nadia had known together for years, in what appeared to be an attempt to create a version of events in the social landscape that would be more favorable to him. This did not work the way he planned, partly because Nadia's friends had already heard from Nadia, and partly because several of them had met Simone at a dinner party 4 months prior and had spent that entire dinner wondering if they should say something to Nadia, and the guilt of that had made them firmly, completely, unambiguously Team Nadia. One friend, a woman named Cora who had known Nadia for 12 years, sent Daniel a text that Nadia never saw but that Cora described to her later as very clear and very final. What Nadia experienced that week, underneath all of the legal and logistical movement, was something she had not fully expected, which was a kind of expanding quietness inside herself. The opposite of how she had felt for the past 2 years, which had been a constant low-level noise of anxiety and monitoring and careful management of her own emotions. Now that everything was in motion, now that the truth was fully in the light, now that she had stopped waiting for something to get better and started building something new, the noise was going away. She sat in her kitchen in the evenings with her mother and her aunt and drank tea and talked about Priya's wedding, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, like herself. Daniel moved out on a Thursday. He packed his things over 2 days. He was careful and quiet about it, which told Nadia that his lawyer had advised him to be. He took his clothes and his personal items and his work equipment, and he did not take anything from the shared spaces of the house because his lawyer had told him not to, and because Nadia's documentation of what had been purchased jointly and what had been purchased by whom was extremely thorough. He came downstairs on the last evening with a last bag and stood for a moment in the hallway. He looked at Nadia, who was sitting in the living room. He seemed like he was going to say something that required a very long setup, and Nadia did not have the energy for the setup, so she said quietly and without cruelty, "Be well, Daniel." He looked at her for another moment, then he picked up his bag and left. Aunt Rosa came from the kitchen and stood in the doorway of the living room. Helen came and sat next to Nadia on the couch. Nobody said anything for a little while. The house felt very still, not empty, still. There is a difference. Empty is something missing, still is something settled. Then Helen said, "Should I put the kettle on?" And Nadia said yes, and that was how that chapter ended. The months that followed were not without difficulty, because real life does not become simple just because one painful thing is resolved. The legal process took time. There were documents to sign and arguments from Daniel's side to answer, and moments where Patricia called with complications that required patience and clear thinking. There was the emotional weight of dismantling a shared financial life, of separating accounts and assets, and the record of 7 years. There were days when Nadia sat in the house that was slowly becoming only hers again, and felt the particular grief of mourning something that had already been gone for a long time before she let herself admit it. She let herself feel all of it. She did not perform strength. She did not pretend she was fine when she was not. She cried when she needed to and slept when she was tired and called her mother more than she had in years and let Cora take her to dinner twice a month and talk about things that had nothing to do with Daniel. She also kept going work. She kept being the person everyone at the firm depended on. She kept showing up, not because she was pretending things were fine, but because showing up was one of the things she knew how to do well, and it gave her days a shape that helped. Priya's wedding was 6 weeks after Daniel moved out. It was a beautiful wedding. Priya married a kind man named Sanjay who looked at Priya the way Nadia had once hoped Daniel would look at her and had eventually understood he never actually had. Nadia stood at the front of the room in her maid of honor dress, and she held the bouquet and she watched her sister, and she felt genuine joy for her, the uncomplicated kind that arrives when you are not personally in the middle of something terrible but are simply present for someone else's good thing. She danced at the reception. She gave a speech that made people laugh and made Priya cry and made Helen press her hand to her chest. Daniel had been invited to the wedding, in the original invitations sent months before any of this, but had declined to attend, citing a schedule conflict that everyone understood meant he did not want to be in the room. Nadia did not think about him much during the evening. That was its own small victory. At the reception, she sat next to her mother and her aunt, and later in the evening she found herself in a brief conversation with Priya's new father-in-law, a man named Gerald who was warm and funny and asked Nadia intelligent questions about her work and told her about his own career in a way that was interesting rather than impressive. It was a brief and entirely pleasant conversation, the kind that reminds you that there are still ordinary, decent people in the world, and Nadia drove home that night feeling lighter than she had in a long time. The legal resolution came 4 months after Daniel moved out. The details were private and would remain so, but the outcome was what Patricia had told Nadia to expect when the documentation was complete and accurate, which it was. The house was addressed. The finances were addressed. Nadia's contribution was recognized. She did not get everything because that is not how these processes work, but she got enough, and what she got was fair, which was all she had ever asked for. The day she signed the final papers, she sat in Patricia's office and Patricia shook her hand and told her she had been one of her most composed clients in 20 years of practice. Nadia thanked her and went home. That evening, she cooked the same lamb stew that Aunt Rosa had taught her, made enough for herself and the leftovers she would take to work tomorrow, and ate at her kitchen table with a book beside her plate. The kitchen was quiet. The house was quiet. It was hers. She thought about the morning Daniel had introduced Simone in this kitchen, the coffee going cold in her hand, the refrigerator she had chosen, the curtain rod she had hung 3 times until it was level. She thought about how he had looked at her like she should simply accept the new arrangement, like her feelings were a minor inconvenience to his plans. She thought about how she had simply said, "All right. I have some arrangements of my own to make as well," and how he had not understood what that meant until it was already done. Nadia was not triumphant about it in the loud way. She did not feel the hot, sharp satisfaction of winning an argument. What she felt was something quieter and more durable. She felt the particular peace of someone who stayed true to herself under enormous pressure, who did not shout or beg or collapse, who built her response carefully and let the truth do the work, and who emerged on the other side of something terrible with her dignity entirely intact. She thought about the things she had learned, not just about Daniel, but about herself. She had learned that she had been more patient with other people's comfort than was healthy for her. She had learned that keeping the peace is not the same as having peace. She had learned that the quiet, thorough version of herself that Daniel had always slightly underestimated was, in fact, her greatest asset. She had learned that the people who love you will show up when you call them, and that Aunt Rosa would always answer, and that her mother's anger on her behalf was one of the most comforting things she had ever experienced. She had also learned, and this one had taken longer to sit with honestly, that she had known something was wrong for a long time before she let herself act on it. She had waited, hoping the knowing would go away, hoping she was wrong, staying in something past the point of health because leaving felt like admitting a failure she did not want to claim. She understood now that the failure had never been hers. But she also understood that waiting so long had cost her time and energy that she was now going to spend differently. She was 34 years old, she had a house she loved and a job she was good at and a family who showed up and friends who had been fiercely, completely in her corner. She had a lawyer who had been excellent. She had an Aunt Rosa. She had a lot of evenings ahead of her to cook dinner in her own kitchen and read books at her own table and decide day by day what she wanted her life to look like. She washed her dish. She wiped down the counter the way she always did, one pass with the cloth in a clean line. She turned off the kitchen light. She went upstairs to her room and she slept deeply and without interruption. That was what winning looked like for Nadia. Not a scene, not a speech, not a dramatic final confrontation, just a clean kitchen and a full night's sleep in a house that was finally only hers. In the weeks and months that followed, Nadia began, slowly and without any urgency, to build what came next. She was not in a hurry. She had learned the cost of rushing past something important without examining it carefully, and she had no interest in making that mistake in the other direction. She spent time with herself in the quiet way of someone who is getting reacquainted with their own preferences after years of accommodating someone else's. She found that she liked her mornings better without the particular tension that had lived in the house for so long. She liked cooking exactly what she felt like eating without planning around someone else's preferences. She liked her weekends, which now belonged entirely to her choices. She took on a small but meaningful additional responsibility at work, stepping into a project management role for a new contract that the firm had landed. She was good at it. Her boss, a quietly perceptive woman named Dr. Singh, told her during a check-in meeting that she had noticed a change in Nadia over the past several months, a kind of settled focus that had made her already strong work notably stronger. Nadia thanked her. She did not explain the source of the focus, but she understood it. When you are no longer spending enormous amounts of internal energy maintaining a version of your life that is fundamentally untrue, that energy goes somewhere. For Nadia, it went into her work and her cooking and her friendships and her sleep and the slow, honest process of figuring out what she actually wanted. Daniel contacted her once, about 3 months after the final papers were signed. He sent a text that was carefully worded in the way of a man who has had time to think and has perhaps also spoken to a therapist or at least considered it. He said he had been reflecting. He said he knew he had caused real hurt. He said he hoped she was doing well. He did not ask for anything specific, which made Nadia think he was not entirely sure what he was asking for, whether it was forgiveness or absolution or just some sign that she was not entirely settled into a life that had nothing to do with him. Nadia read the text twice. She thought about it for a day, then she wrote back 3 sentences. She said she appreciated the message. She said she was doing well. She said she wished him the same. She did not add anything else because there was nothing else to add. She put her phone down and went back to the book she was reading. Cora came over that Friday, as she had started doing on the first Friday of every month, and they made dinner together and talked about everything except Daniel, because there was genuinely nothing more to say about him. They talked about Priya, who was newly pregnant and very happy, which made Nadia feel the same uncomplicated warmth she had felt at the wedding. They talked about a trip Cora was planning and whether Nadia wanted to come along, and Nadia said maybe and meant it. They talked about a difficult situation that a colleague of Cora's was navigating, and they both had opinions about it, and neither of their opinions were mild, which made them both laugh. They stayed up too late in the way of people who have been friends for a long time and can afford to be honest with each other. After Cora left, Nadia sat in her living room for a little while in the comfortable dark. She thought about who she had been 2 years ago, the woman carefully keeping a notebook and watching a marriage fall apart in slow motion while continuing to iron the shirts of the man who was letting it fall. She thought about the morning in the kitchen and the cold coffee and the sentence she had said in response to being told another woman was moving in. I have some arrangements of my own to make as well. She thought about how afraid she had been in the months before that, afraid of the size of the change, afraid of the loss, afraid of having to rebuild everything she thought she had. She thought about how much smaller that fear looked from where she was sitting now in her own living room with a full life and a clear mind, and a house she had relearned to love without anyone making her feel like a guest in it. She thought about Aunt Rosa showing up and making tea and looking at Daniel with absolute undisturbed calm. She thought about her mother arriving with food and fury and sitting down at the table and picking up the papers. She thought about Patricia's steady voice explaining the financial picture with the patience of someone who believed in Nadia's case because the facts supported it. She thought about Simone coming downstairs and finding 2 women at the table with paperwork and a teapot and the particular silence of women who are not going anywhere. She thought about the front door closing behind Daniel on that Thursday evening and the stillness that had settled into the house afterward. She was not angry anymore. That had surprised her how quickly the anger had finished its work and stepped aside for something else. She was not sad in the way she had expected to be sad. She was something closer to clear. The way a room looks after all the furniture has been rearranged into positions that finally make sense, with space where there was clutter and light where there was shadow, and the whole shape of things finally showing its true proportion. She had been overlooked and she had been replaced in her own home, and she had been expected to accept both of those things quietly because that is what people who are used to being dependable are often expected to do, absorb the cost of other people's choices without complaint. But Nadia had not accepted it quietly in the end. She had accepted it strategically. She had taken the time she needed to understand exactly where she stood, and then she had stood there fully and completely without apology. And the difference between those two things, between absorbing quietly and standing fully, was the difference between the woman she had been and the woman she had become. She stood up from the couch. She stretched. She went to the window and looked out at the street for a moment, the quiet neighborhood she had chosen, the yard she had kept, the life that was still here and was genuinely fully hers. She thought without drama that she was proud of herself, not for winning, not for any particular legal outcome or social victory or dramatic moment of exposure. She was proud of herself for staying honest, for not breaking down in ways that would have hurt her position, for not taking the easy road of a public breakdown or a mean-spirited exposure campaign, for trusting that calm truth was more powerful than loud pain, for calling Aunt Rosa, for calling Patricia, for sitting at her kitchen table with her book and her one plate and refusing to be made to feel like a stranger in her own life. That was the thing nobody tells you about quiet strength, Nadia thought. It does not look like anything from the outside. Nobody claps for it. There is no dramatic moment that gets shared or replayed. It just slowly, steadily changes the entire direction of your life, and you feel it not as a sudden shift, but as a returning to yourself, a coming home to your own mind and your own worth in a way that is too personal and too interior to explain to anyone else. You just know. You wake up in your own house in the morning and you feel like it belongs to you and you belong to it, and that feeling is the whole of the victory. She turned off the living room light. She went up to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, the particular small sounds of a building at rest, and she thought, I am okay. She did not need anything else. She was okay, which was, after everything, exactly enough. If Nadia's story brought up something for you, I want you to sit with this for a moment. She did not win by being louder or angrier or more dramatic than anyone else in that house. She won by knowing exactly who she was and what she had built and refusing to let anyone's behavior make her forget it. If you have ever been the person in a room who everyone assumed would just absorb the cost, the one who keeps things together while someone else tears things down, I want to know, what would you have done differently from Nadia, or what would you have done exactly the same? Drop it in the comments because the people who are watching this deserve to hear from you, and so does Nadia.